Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, thank you. And to the chairman of the Small Business Committee and the ranking member, thank you for your work on this legislation. Senator Landry, you've spoken about the necessity, particularly in this environment today as we're coming out of a recession, the need to ensure that we have that conducive environment for our small businesses to thrive. It's not just about incentives and opportunities. It really is that business environment. And one of the things that I think that is important for us as policymakers to look at is those things that are put in place that perhaps smother our businesses, whether it's through regulation or the cost of the permitting, but also those things that create uncertainty. And that is what I'd like to speak to for just a few minutes this afternoon. The minority leader has put forth an amendment just several hours ago that would put a stop to the EPA's command and control climate regulations. This is an amendment that I'm rising today to offer my support. This is not the first time I've had an opportunity to be here on the Senate floor and speak about my concern about the agency advancing policies ahead of the Congress, of the EPA advancing regulations that set climate policy, again, before the Congress had acted. We spent a considerable amount of time here last year discussing the pitfalls of EPA's massive and unprecedented expansion of regulatory powers as they sought to advance those regulations that would impose that uncertainty on our businesses. I remain as convinced now as I was when we had the arguments previous, when we were talking about this resolution of disapproval against the EPA. I remain as convinced as ever that EPA's effort to impose these backdoor climate regulations is the wrong way, and perhaps it's the worst way to address our nation's energy and climate challenges. Our country is struggling to recover from the worst economic downturn in our modern history. We talk daily about the need for us as lawmakers to advance those policies that will help our nation, help to restore job growth in this country. All this is going on in the midst of global events that are clearly out of our control. We've got chaotic global events that have driven our energy prices to near 2-year highs. The last thing in the world for us to do would be to allow unelected bureaucrats to impose new economic burdens on our families and on our businesses. In combination with these recent events overseas, the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gases is helping to contribute to increased energy prices. The proliferation, and the numbers are astounding in terms of what the EPA is advancing, in terms of these regulations that hit our businesses every day. The proliferation of EPA rulemakings on climate change is now creating pervasive uncertainty throughout our economy. It has stymied and delayed new investments in energy production. And this situation will only become worse once the temporary relief that is provided by the EPA's tailoring rule, once this is tossed out by the courts or perhaps ratcheted down by EPA's own timeline. But what's most troubling is that the EPA has consistently failed to consider what the economic impact of their rulemaking, what the impact is. We have asked repeatedly, and yet there is no response back from the EPA. It's kind of a shell game that we have seen moving forward. First, the EPA claimed, well, it's an endangerment finding, and that is simply a scientific finding. It's nothing more. There's not going to be any regulatory burdens that would be created as a result of it. And then we saw a deal struck between the automakers, the state of California, the environmentalists, and the EPA to tie emissions and their standards to already enacted mileage increases for light-duty vehicles. That move then triggered regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act for all emitters, including stationary sources. But here again, there was no economic analysis provided by the EPA. And the lack of this analysis or this assessment and the lack of information led many members of Congress, myself included, to repeatedly ask for a study of the potential impacts. But EPA has disregarded these requests. Finally, they published their tailing rule, which was not only finished without a real economic analysis, but it somewhat brazenly pitched as regulatory relief. They first said that this was not a burden that had been imposed, and then they come back and they say, well, now we're providing regulatory relief. Kind of an odd claim to have made. But what became clear throughout all of this is that the EPA wants us to believe that none of their actions have imposed new regulatory requirements, and therefore there's no cost. If we haven't added any regulatory burden, there's not going to be any subsequent cost. But this assertion simply denies logic. Their regulations require that expensive new permits be obtained, and to do that, you have expensive new technologies that have to be purchased, operated, and installed. And in the next few years, these requirements will become more severe, and more businesses will be folded in to face them. And to accept these economy-wide climate regulations with no substantive analysis of their economic impacts is really to take a huge gamble with an already fragile American economy. And this is a gamble that I believe, Mr. President, we should not take. And the amendment from the minority leader that was presented earlier today would ensure that we do not. As I mentioned, just starting off on my comments, I think it is fitting that this debate does take place on legislation that is designed to help our small businesses. It's true that because the EPA has decided that they're not going to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, but not according to it, they're not going to regulate the small businesses at this point in time. But soon, however, they're going to be caught up in the same net as their larger counterparts. And in the meantime, as the customers of the refiners and the power plants throughout the country are now regulated, our small businesses will inevitably face increased costs. Innovation should not mean having to find creative ways to comply with government regulations in order to keep your doors open. Now, fortunately, it's not too late to prevent this situation from becoming worse. The first round of regulations kicked in at the start of this year, and then the so-called new source performance standards for refineries and power plants, one of the next steps in the EPA's regulatory process. These aren't expected until later this year. We can and we should step in now to prevent this additional growth of the now sweeping regulatory burden from the EPA. If we don't act now, if we fail to act now, America's competitive position in the world will continue to deteriorate. And this should be cause for concern for all of us serving here in the Congress. But unfortunately, we've not only failed to put a stop to this agenda, but some have actually embraced it. Explanations are out there, I'm sure, but perhaps the most common is a misplaced hope that by forcing consumers to pay more for energy, that somehow or other this is going to usher in the green jobs to manufacture the wind turbines and other equipment that can just as easily be made overseas. It's this kind of thinking that brought us to where we were last year, the year before, with the tremendously unpopular cap-and-trade bill. For too many in this town, here in Washington, D.C., higher energy prices have been an explicit goal. The president, when the cap-and-trade proposal was being debated, very clearly stated, his words, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Secretary of Energy has said just a couple years ago, and his quote, "Somehow we've got to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe." Notably, I think those comments were made when gasoline was even more expensive than it is today. But every member of this chamber should know and recognize where EPA is going with these regulations now. They're the administration's Plan B, initially meant to force us here in Congress to pass cap and trade, and now a poor substitute for it. So I think the question that is worth asking is, if cap and trade couldn't pass for lack of support, why should we let these regulations replace them? If we wouldn't agree to a legislative program because it was too damaging, why would we let command and control regulations pressed into place through rulemakings be the answer instead? If we knew that these regulations are a bad idea whose time should not have come, why would we let American families and businesses suffer greater and greater consequences? Mr. President, in the midst of our economic recovery and high energy prices, we need to protect our small businesses, not expose them to new regulatory burdens. I think the minority leader's amendment would do just that. I'm hopeful that the Senate will have an opportunity to vote on it and pass it within the near future. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.